Hello again, gamers. Welcome back to the Board Game Captain. I'm the Board Game Captain, and today I'm going to be reviewing a role-playing game by the name of Rocket Age. Now, Rocket Age was designed by Ken Spencer and is currently published by Why Not Games. Now, Rocket Age is a game that is meant to represent the old pulp serials of the 1930s and 40s, and also, to a lesser extent, the pulp sci-fi novels or Sword and Planet novels that predated those serials. So you can think of things like John Carter of Mars, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, and to a lesser extent, some of the later sci-fi slash fantasy mixed together things that were inspired by those. So like, to a lesser extent, Star Wars. To a lesser extent, though, it very much is heavy on the ray gun and rocket ship and electro sword and that sort of feeling of the older kind of pulp sci-fi or Sword and Planet genre. Now, the theme is absolutely awesome in this, and it's dripping with theme. In this game, you're in an alternate universe where we discovered the ability for space travel and have landed on other planets way back in the early part of the 20th century through a joint venture by Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla, and it's so funny, but it's awesome because it's the kind of thing that the old sci-fi serials and sci-fi books and movies were promising us was going to happen. That any day now we were going to land on Mars and Venus. And we, instead of, at this point in the late 30s, instead of having kicked off World War II, we're in the middle of kind of colonial wars. It's unclear whether there's going to be like a solar war, like a solar system war, but we're in the middle of colonial wars as the pre-Axis and Allies powers who are colonizing Mars and Venus and going out and contacting aliens that are even on the moons of Jupiter and such, and even further out in the solar system, are starting to fight over colonies and resource rights and discovering of ancient alien technology, especially on Mars. And it's really awesome. So like the first game I played of this was at a convention, and we sat down around the table. Lynn had wanted to check it out because she's a big fan of the nostalgic old school retro futurism, which is what this game is all about. And we sat down, we had signed up to play a game of Rocket Age at Gen Con. This was a number of years ago. And it was going to be a game where we were going to be a motley crew of a rocket ship that were hired to thwart the plans of some evil Nazis on Mars. And I mean, it was awesome. And we're sitting down, and we were there for a while before I realized that the gentleman running our game was Ken Spencer, the guy who wrote the book, which was awesome because I was really enjoying the game, and he was probably one of the best game masters I ever played with. And there is not a ounce of hyperbole in that statement. So it was no surprise to me when I eventually got the books that these are incredibly imaginative, incredibly well written. The book was a joy to read. I shot through it in a few days because I really enjoyed reading all the storyline. It is mostly storyline. It thoroughly tells you a lot about Mars and gives you the most fleshed out information about Mars, followed by Venus, followed by the rest of the solar system. You get a bit of information on Mercury and what's going on there, as well as the moon, as well as the moons of Jupiter, and a little bit about Jupiter itself, and even some of the moons of Saturn further out into the solar system, and Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You get lots of races to choose from because you can be human, but you can also be lots of other races from other different planets. There are Martians, and there are lots of, because of the Martian caste system, there's lots of sub-races of Martians that specialize in all sorts of different things, be it warfare or psychic abilities. There are Venusians, which look like giant ape people and are incredibly strong, but also have psychic abilities and are more like warrior philosophers and very interesting in their design. There are Europans and Ganymedians and Ionians, and all of them are very different and really well described in this book. This is the main book, and you don't really need anything else to play. This in your imagination is really enough, though there are 4 other expansions, 2 that go into further detail about Mars and Venus at this point, 1 that gives you more detail about the different races of the solar system, as well as giving you a couple other playable races that are newly discovered, and another one that gives you a big campaign to play throughout this world. But that being said, this book is all you need to get into it. Now, the book is very well written. I thoroughly enjoyed reading all of the fluff in here, as well as the rules. I do like the rules quite a bit. There are a couple of issues in the text of it. There were a couple of things that were obviously either left over from earlier revisions that, maybe it could have used one more revision to get them out, but it wasn't too bad. For instance, there are 3 references to wildlife on Io, I believe it is, which is a bit of a blasted wasteland. The planet of Io had at some time in the past really upset the Europans, which are the most technologically advanced alien race in the universe, and the Ioites got bombed back to the Stone Age, basically. Now, in 2 references to Io, they reference that there are these giant mutated monsters on Io, and in one reference, they say there's no monsters larger than a rat. Well, so I think that single reference was probably left over from an earlier edit, and it's not that big a deal. I just went with the fact that there were more references to giant mutated monsters to assume, there's more, giant mutated monsters there. Until another book comes out to give more information in detail about what Io is like, I'll just assume, you can have lots of big monsters and just use some of the stats for the giant monster animals in this book to represent them. That's a minor issue. There were a couple issues also where I found 2 other areas where rules, their examples, contradicted the rule a little bit. But again, I feel that's probably just an issue with revisions. And the rule themselves in those cases was very clear. It was just the example that confused things. So I just ignored the example. Other than that, the rulebook is very well done. It is very interesting. It is a good read and very enjoyable. And the rules are easy to understand. This is part of these newer trend in role-playing games where they emphasize storytelling over rules, so you don't really ever have to spend lots of time sifting through the rule book during a game. It just doesn't happen. The rules are so simple and easy to use that there's with the exception of maybe buying equipment, which is really done between games, shouldn't be done during games, you're never going to spend lots of time sifting through the book to look up some, obscure rule. It just doesn't happen. So let me talk a little bit about how this game plays. Now, this is a game that primarily works off of using 2 6-sided dice, which is usually in most role-playing games, this one included, abbreviated as 2d6 for 2 6-sided dice. Now, the way it works is when you make your character, you have 6 stats. Every attribute, every statistic has to have at least 1 point in it. So all 6 of those attributes has to be at a minimum of 1. Then you have 12 skills. Now, you can have skills that you have no skill in, but these are more specific areas of expertise. It can be things like shooting or sword fighting, or your transportation, for instance, is the ability for all of your ability to use technological vehicles. So when you want to do something like, let's say, do an Immelman with your rocket ship or a barrel roll, you're going to roll you're going to roll 2 dice and add the number of the relevant stat, plus the relevant skill. So you roll your 2 dice, you get an average of a 7, and you add let's say you have a 3 in your dexterity and a 3 in your transportation, you add 6 to that roll. Now, the average difficulty of a roll that you would need to roll is usually about 15, because that's something that's a little bit tricky that you need to roll for. Lower than that, a difficulty 12 is something that's normal, that you normally, unless there's something distracting, you wouldn't even need to roll for. I mean, with a distraction, the game master might say, okay, roll, but it's only a difficulty 12, so you'll most likely get it. Lower than that are things that you should almost never have to roll for. Higher than that, because you can have complications that make things even harder, all the way up to nearly impossible, which would be a 30 difficulty. As you level up and as you increase your skills, instead of gaining a skill point, once you have a skill at level 3, you can take a specialization for the same cost that you would get to raise that skill 1 point. So for instance, we'll go back to transportation because I keep talking about transportation. Maybe you want to specialize in rocket ships. So you have 3 in your transportation skill, but now you take a specialization of rocket ships, which will give you a +2 to that skill when used with rocket ships, but nothing else. So if you're doing like a hard turn or drifting with a car, you're still getting +3 to that roll for your 3 in transportation. But if you're pulling a loop-de-loop with your rocket ship, you're getting +5 to that roll. And I find that to be really interesting. The rules are very quick and easy to understand. You also can often come up with interesting ways to justify using alternate attributes or skills to do things that they weren't intended to do to the game master. And as long as it makes sense, you can do it. Because, for instance, you might be using like your physical dexterity usually for doing range shots, but maybe if you're waiting for someone to present a target, instead you could use like your observational type attributes, some sort of thing for noticing, that they jump out, and use that instead of your dexterity because you're just waiting in ambush. And as long as you can justify it to your game master, they can allow or disallow as they see fit. But as long as you justify it well, it encourages the game masters to reward interesting thinking like that. One of the other things that's very interesting in this game, in my opinion, is the story points, which every character gets a number of story points, which you can increase as you go up levels as well, just like you can with skills. And the thing about story points is they have a lot of uses. Now, there's no real money in this game. Most easy to come by equipment you can just talk to your game master and have within reason. There are some equipment that will cost you story points because they required a lot of effort and time to get, in which case you have to actually permanently lose those story points to get those equipment. Actual rocket ships come to mind, and sometimes rocket ships can be so expensive you may need to pool story points amongst the group to buy them. And there are some things that are so expensive, like gigantic rocket ships, really, really big ones, the size of battleships, which there's no way you would get without a storyline reason for having it. And now the story points, though, in addition to being able to use to buy these cool items, these legendary weapons or rocket ships or cool things, they also have ways to use them in games for re-rolls, for adding to rolls after the fact. You have story points that you haven't permanently spent on items, and in those cases they can be used temporarily during a game, giving you a temporary reduction that you will get back at the beginning of next game to get your re-roll or to increase a roll, or in some cases you can spend a lot of them to even force an alteration of the story itself. Like, let's say you're all surrounded by angry Martians, and you really don't want to be taken captive, but maybe you haven't used any of your story points, and you're like, hey, Game Master, how many story points would you take for me to recognize one of those Martians as one of the people I saved back there when I rescued those bunch of Martians from the slavers? And your Game Master says, 10 story points, do you have that? And you go, yes! And you burn all 10 story points, and you go, hey, Phil! and he's like, wait, guys, I know these people. They rescued me from those slavers. And you can do that, and it's really, really cool. It's expensive to do, and you'll lose a lot of story points that you could otherwise use for smaller things like re-rolling dice, but it's an amazingly interesting way to alter the story that usually, in most other role-playing games, only the Game Master would be able to do. It reminds me a little bit of the story cards from Savage Worlds, except this one lets you be more creative about it because you come up with the actual twist in the story rather than it being the card who says, oh, you recognize someone you know. Another thing with the story points is there are sometimes items, or in some cases, special abilities like perks that you can get that you have to spend story points on to activate. My personal favorite one of which is a MacGyver type perk where you can spend points on it to jury rig a gadget together to help you with whatever your current situation is. That one is a lot of fun, especially if you're making a MacGyver type character, a MacGyver type hero, someone who's maybe the engineer of your rocket team. Now, in addition, this book has lots of cool different monsters in it that you can run into. Monsters that look like all sorts of sort of stereotypical giant lizards and giant furry monsters that you might see in those old school sci-fi and Sword and Planet books and serials. And you know, this is just a really cool, really fun book. I love the aliens. I love the theme. I love the crunchy enough to be interesting rules, but quick enough to emphasize storytelling. And I love the ability to use story points to alter the story as a player. I even love that from a game master's perspective. I just find this incredibly fun. The artwork is characterful and interesting. The world is really interesting. They have lots of vile villains for you to fight, and even though it's meant to be like lighthearted, you can also take it more seriously because this can deal with serious topics like fascism and colonialism and the exploitation of a lesser advanced native species, which is something that they touch on. You can have this be as lighthearted or as serious as you want. This is a really fun role-playing game. I like the system, I like the story, I like the world, I like the book. If you are a fan of old pulp-style adventure, sci-fi movies, serials, books, things like that, I highly recommend checking this out. I'm going to give Rocket Age, the role-playing game, 8 out of 10 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. At this point, I've played it about half a dozen times. I've liked it every time I've played it, and I really, really, really like the fast-paced nature of it and the innovative and very much the encouragement of innovative thinking and thinking outside the box with those story points. So 8 out of 10 stars for me. Now, let's get a second opinion because different opinions do matter. Lynn, how many stars out of 10 would you give to Rocket Age?
8.
So Lynn is right there with me. That is 16 total stars between the two of us. 8 from me, 8 stars from Lynn. We both highly recommend Rocket Age. We both like it a lot. And actually, I'm hoping to, at some time in the near future, run a campaign of this myself because I have an idea for a really long-running campaign with a reoccurring villain that you love to hate and with lots of cliffhanger endings. Well, maybe 1 out of 3 of the games. Don't want to overdo the cliffhangers. But, yeah. So if you like retrofuturism, if you're a fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs or Flash Gordon or any of those old pulp era stuff, yeah, check out Rocket Age. If you enjoyed this review of the role-playing game Rocket Age, be sure to give it a like, share it on all forms of social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Board Game Kaptain. That's Kaptain spelled with a K on YouTube. And until next time, game on.